The story begins on an unusually quiet Wednesday morning. The streets of the suburban town are calm, with only a few cars passing through as dawn's early light filters through the trees. Residents are going about their routines, parents making breakfast, joggers hitting the pavement, and kids reluctantly getting ready for school. The calm is almost palpable, a sense of mundane regularity hanging in the air, as if nothing unusual or newsworthy could disturb this quiet little bubble of normalcy. Niek Williams, a seasoned Secret Service agent, steps out of her car with purpose. She's dressed in her plain clothes today, though her sharp, no-nonsense demeanor suggests she's no stranger to high-stakes situations. Tall and athletic, with an air of confidence earned through years of rigorous training, she has a quiet authority about her. She's in town on official business. Nothing flashy, just a discreet check-in with a contact on a classified assignment. Niek's reputation precedes her in the agency. She's known for being sharp, resilient, and dedicated. Her colleagues often say that she has a sixth sense for trouble and a relentless commitment to getting the job done. The strength of her reputation is even more impressive considering the obstacles she has had to face as a black woman in a field dominated by men. Those challenges only fueled her resolve to excel, shaping her into a powerful force in national security. As she walks down the sidewalk, her mind is focused, moving swiftly between different pieces of information she needs to confirm for her case. She's neither tense nor overly relaxed, embodying the poised balance of an experienced agent. She double-checks her surroundings, a habit from her training that makes her hyper-aware of the people and places around her. Today, though, her heightened awareness hints at a sense of something out of place, a faint warning in her mind. A few blocks away, Officers Blake and Hanson sit in their patrol car, observing the streets. They've worked together for several years, and their partnership has settled into a comfortable, if sometimes strained, rhythm. Blake, the senior officer, leans back in the driver's seat, casually scanning the street. His stance is relaxed, but his gaze is sharp, his mind already primed with assumptions. Blake prides himself on being a seasoned man of the law, though his version of law enforcement often involves judging people by their appearances and jumping to conclusions based on his biases. Tall, with a broad build and a quick temper, he's the type who believes in making snap decisions and rarely second-guesses himself. Hanson, on the other hand, is younger and still has a sense of idealism about his role as an officer. He's conscientious and thoughtful, often questioning Blake's methods in his mind, though he rarely speaks up. Hanson's hesitation stems from a complicated loyalty to his partner and a fear of being dismissed or ridiculed for having a more nuanced approach. Unlike Blake, he sees the individuals they encounter as people rather than mere subjects. This morning, as he observes Blake's demeanor, he can sense his partner's impatience, which usually spells trouble. Blake's frustration is apparent, a kind of simmering restlessness that he channels into his work whenever he's bored or looking to assert his authority. Then, Blake spots Niek. He stiffens, his eyes narrowing as he watches her walk briskly down the street. She doesn't look like she's from this town. At least not according to his narrow view of who belongs and who doesn't. Without saying a word to Hanson, Blake reaches for his radio and mutters something about a suspicious individual. Hanson glances over, his brow furrowing. To him, Niek looks like any other professional woman walking with purpose. But Blake's expression has already hardened, and his gaze remains fixed on her. Hanson senses Blake's intentions before he even says them aloud, and a pit forms in his stomach. He's seen this look before, a look that says Blake has already made up his mind about who Niek is and why she's here. Blake's grip tightens on the door handle as he nods to Hanson, who reluctantly follows his lead, though his instincts are telling him this isn't right. When Blake approaches Niek, his posture is confrontational from the outset. Without introducing himself, he calls out to her, his tone sharp and loaded with implicit suspicion. "Excuse me, ma'am. Mind telling me what you're doing here?" he asks, with no intention of taking her response seriously. Niek stops, assessing him with a calm, neutral expression, though her instincts are already alert. She introduces herself clearly, mentioning that she's a federal agent on official business and producing her identification, which bears the unmistakable credentials of the Secret Service. But Blake barely glances at it before he scoffs, his dismissive smirk signaling he doesn't believe her. In his mind, he's already convinced that she's lying, that she's posing as someone she isn't. His assumption clouds his judgment, and he decides then and there that she's some kind of threat. "Nice try," he says coldly. "Mind stepping over here?" Neek, sensing the escalation, tries to reason with him, keeping her voice even. She repeats her credentials, adding details to clarify her assignment, but Blake cuts her off, telling her not to play games. His voice grows louder, his body language more forceful, as if determined to assert dominance over her. Hansen stands a few feet away, shifting uncomfortably. He's seen Blake act this way before, but something about this situation feels different. Watching Neek's calm professionalism in the face of Blake's aggression makes him question everything he's been told about who deserves suspicion. He knows he should intervene, that he should remind Blake to be careful before making baseless accusations, but the weight of their partnership keeps him silent. Doubts crowd his mind, but his loyalty to Blake and his fear of challenging him holds him back. Blake, however, continues to push. He moves closer, reaching for Nick's arm. "You're coming with us," he says, making his disdain for her clear. His grip on her arm is firm and unyielding, his mind made up. Neek resists, keeping her composure as she informs him once again of her rights and her role as a federal agent. Her calm, unwavering tone seems to infuriate Blake even more, fueling his insistence that she must be hiding something. In the back of his mind, Hansen feels the conflict boiling over, the awareness that this entire situation has spiraled out of control because of Blake's bias. And yet, he remains silent, watching as Neek is handcuffed, her hands restrained by the very system she serves. The quiet morning has now shattered, replaced by a scene of growing tension, as Neek stands detained for reasons entirely fabricated by one man's prejudice. Her sense of professionalism and composure remains steady, but a fire begins to burn within her, a recognition of the injustice she's facing, and the realization that this fight is only beginning. Neek felt the cold steel of the handcuffs bite into her wrists as Officer Blake tightened them, his jaw set with a self-righteous conviction that disgusted her. She kept her face calm, maintaining her composure, but beneath the surface, her mind raced, processing the layers of insult, danger, and absurdity wrapped up in this one moment. She could hear Blake's heavy breathing as he pulled her toward the patrol car, his grip on her arm overly firm, each step a reminder of his unchecked authority. Blake seemed to grow more assured, his confidence swelling with every second. He hadn't encountered any resistance from his partner Hansen, whose silence only served to embolden him. To Blake, Hansen's silence was as good as agreement, confirmation that his actions were justified. In his mind, every protest Nick made was further evidence that she was up to no good, and her calm demeanor, her insistence on repeating her Secret Service credentials, only made him more certain she was lying. It never occurred to him to reconsider his own assumptions. He was fully committed to the story he had fabricated in his mind. Neek, however, refused to let her anger show. She'd been trained to maintain control under extreme circumstances, to keep her wits even when faced with hostility or danger. Yet, this was different. This wasn't an adversary with a weapon or a dangerous suspect. It was a supposed ally, a police officer, who was treating her as a threat without any reason. That made the injustice sting even more, especially as Blake completely disregarded her identity, her training, and her right to simply do her job. Hansen followed along reluctantly, his face pale as he glanced between Neek and Blake. The pit in his stomach grew as he watched his partner's demeanor harden. Hansen had seen Blake cross lines before, bending rules when it suited him, but this felt different. There was something in Neek's eyes that spoke volumes, an indignation that she kept well contained, a fierce resolve that only someone deeply wronged could hold. Hansen wanted to say something, but the words tangled up inside him. He could sense that something was terribly off, that Blake was going too far, but he couldn't bring himself to challenge his senior officer openly. Every time he opened his mouth, Fear took over. Fear of Blake's reaction, fear of the backlash, fear of what might happen to his own career if he openly opposed his partner. Blake opened the back door of the patrol car and gestured for Nick to get in. As she moved to sit, she turned to him once more, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "I've told you who I am and shown you my credentials. Detaining me is not only a violation of my rights, but it's also obstructing federal business. You need to rethink this, officer." Her voice was unshakable, her gaze unwavering, challenging him in a way few people had ever dared. But Blake only sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can intimidate me with that federal agent story? You might have fooled some people, but not me. Now get in the car," he snapped, his words dripping with disdain. Neek held his gaze for a moment longer before complying, sliding into the back seat with her hands still cuffed, her body held rigid. The door slammed shut, and she was engulfed by the silence and confined space, her mind now laser-focused on her next steps. She knew she had a limited window to act before this incident spiraled further out of control, but she would have to bide her time and wait for the right opportunity. As the car pulled away, Hansen sat quietly in the passenger seat, his mind in turmoil. His conscience was screaming at him to do something, to say something, but the weight of fear kept him paralyzed. As they drove, Blake spoke loudly, almost as if he were trying to convince himself as much as Hansen. "These kinds of people think they can just walk around claiming whatever they want, making everyone else do their bidding," he muttered. "I've seen it 1,000 times. They use the system, but the second we hold them accountable, they throw around words like federal agent. It's pathetic." Hansen felt a pang of guilt with every word Blake uttered. He knew that what they were doing was wrong, that Niek was almost certainly telling the truth, and that his silence made him complicit in her mistreatment. He wanted to protest, to tell Blake that he was crossing a line, but his words were stifled by the years of unspoken rules he had followed. The rules that told him to defer to his senior partner, to keep quiet, to go along. Every glance at the rearview mirror, where he could just make out Niek's face in the back seat, reminded him that his silence was a choice, a betrayal of the principles he had once sworn to uphold. In the back seat, Niek took steady breaths, focusing on remaining calm. She knew the power of perception and how much it mattered in situations like this. Any sign of anger or defiance could be misconstrued, used against her. She'd seen it happen too many times before to people in her community, how one misplaced expression or gesture could fuel someone's prejudice, turn a situation against the innocent. But she wasn't helpless. She knew her rights, and she knew how to fight back within the bounds of the law. Right now, her goal was to stay safe and alert, waiting for the moment when she could use her position, her knowledge, to her advantage. Blake pulled into the station, parking the car and getting out with a sense of smug satisfaction. He moved to open Niek's door, pulling her out of the back seat and leading her inside. His grip on her arm remained unnecessarily tight, a silent reminder of his perceived authority. Hansen followed, trailing slightly behind, his face a mask of unease as they entered the station. As they walked in, a few other officers glanced over, their expressions a mix of curiosity and indifference. Blake marched Niek up to the front desk, ignoring the questioning look from the desk sergeant. "I've got someone here who's been impersonating a federal agent," Blake announced, loud enough for everyone around to hear. He glanced at Niek, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "Claims she's Secret Service." The desk sergeant raised an eyebrow, glancing from Blake to Niek. She looked at Blake, her expression a mixture of skepticism and confusion. "Let me see her credentials," she said, extending her hand toward Blake. Blake fumbled for a moment, realizing that he hadn't even checked Niek's badge properly before dismissing it as fake. Reluctantly, he pulled the ID out of his pocket and handed it to the sergeant, watching as she examined it closely. Her eyebrows knit together as she scrutinized the badge and the name on it. After a tense pause, she looked up at Blake with an incredulous expression. "Blake, this is real. She's with the Secret Service," she said, her voice a mix of shock and reproach. For the first time, Blake's confidence faltered. His face flushed and he stammered, She could have forged it. You don't know that." But even as he spoke, he could sense that his reasoning was falling apart. His initial certainty, the arrogance that had fueled his actions, began to waver. Niek, her expression calm but her eyes piercing, took the opportunity to speak up. "As I tried to tell you several times, I'm here on official business. Your actions have already obstructed my work, and you've detained me without cause." "This is a serious violation, officer." Blake clenched his jaw, his pride refusing to let him back down entirely. But he could feel the gazes of his colleagues on him, could sense their doubt and judgment creeping into the room. For a brief moment, Hansen considered stepping in, adding his voice to Niek's to validate her claims, but he stayed silent, shame mixing with his relief that someone else had stepped in. But Blake wasn't ready to concede defeat. He straightened, attempting to salvage his authority. "I don't care what your badge says. You didn't act like a federal agent out there. You gave me every reason to doubt you." He glanced around, his tone growing defensive. "We're just doing our job, keeping people safe. And sometimes that means taking risks, even if it makes some people uncomfortable." Hansen swallowed, feeling the tension growing unbearable. He knew that the situation was spiraling, that Blake's ego was preventing him from acknowledging his mistake, and that if he didn't do something now, things could get even worse. His conscience screamed at him to speak, to finally stand up for what he knew was right, but his silence held him captive, a weight that grew heavier with every second. Niek, however, had had enough. Her expression hardened, and she took a step forward, addressing the room rather than just Blake. "I've been trained to protect this country and its people, to uphold the law, and that includes defending myself against abuses of power. This was a gross misuse of authority, and it won't go unnoticed." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made everyone listening understand the gravity of her words. Blake's face turned red, his embarrassment boiling over into anger, but he knew that he was losing control of the situation, that his attempt to dominate had backfired spectacularly. As the realization began to settle in, he looked around, seeing the judgment in the eyes of his colleagues. His fists clenched, but there was nothing left for him to say. The atmosphere in the station was tense and charged as Niek stood firm, her calm words hanging in the air. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, with several officers exchanging glances, unsure of how to react. It was unusual to see someone so composed and certain in the face of Officer Blake's authority. But Niek knew her rights, and her voice conveyed not just her outrage, but her resolve to make sure her rights were upheld. Her presence commanded respect, and for the first time, Blake looked unsure, his confidence shaken as he struggled to regain control of the situation. At that moment, the door of the station swung open, and a tall man in a suit stepped in. His presence immediately drew attention. He walked with an air of authority and purpose that made everyone take notice. Special Agent Tyler Briggs of the Secret Service had arrived, and he wasn't wasting any time. His gaze quickly found Niek, and his expression softened as he gave her a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement that she was no longer alone in this fight. But when his eyes moved to Blake, the expression turned cold and unyielding. Briggs was known within the Secret Service as a fair but no-nonsense agent, someone who didn't tolerate misconduct, especially when it jeopardized the work of his agents. He had heard the commotion from outside the station, having arrived just in time to witness the end of Blake's confrontation with Niek. Without hesitation, he walked straight to the front desk, his eyes fixed on the officers around him, making it clear he was there to set things right. "Who is responsible for detaining my agent?" Briggs's voice was calm but held a note of authority that demanded immediate attention. He didn't raise his voice, but the power behind his words was unmistakable. Blake stiffened, trying to put on a facade of confidence, but it was clear that he was caught off guard. "I am," he replied, though his voice wavered slightly. "I had reason to believe she was impersonating a federal officer, so I detained her for questioning." Briggs raised an eyebrow, studying Blake with an intensity that made the officer visibly uncomfortable. "Impersonating? Did she not show you her credentials?" Blake hesitated, his face reddening. "She did, but anyone could have a fake badge. I needed to make sure. It was my duty to verify her identity," he said defensively, clearly struggling to keep his story intact in the face of Briggs's scrutiny. Briggs held Blake's gaze for a moment longer, and the silence felt suffocating. Finally, he spoke, his voice even. "Officer, this agent has been cleared through every level of background and security check imaginable. She's been trained to handle situations that most people can't even comprehend, and she's here on official business. Do you realize the gravity of detaining a federal agent without cause?" Blake stammered, his bravado crumbling as he struggled to defend his actions. "I was just doing my job, sir. I had to be certain," he muttered, though his voice had lost all the edge it held earlier. Briggs didn't waver. Doing your job doesn't mean acting on baseless assumptions or letting personal bias interfere with protocol. Detaining Agent Williams without proper cause isn't just unprofessional, it's obstruction. If anything had happened to her or her assignment because of your actions, you would be facing much graver consequences than a reprimand. His tone left no room for doubt. He was here to hold Blake accountable, and there would be no excuses accepted. As Blake squirmed, the precinct captain entered, alerted by the commotion. A stocky man in his early 50s with a graying mustache, Captain Reynolds immediately sensed the tension in the room. He looked from Briggs to Blake, quickly assessing the situation, and nodded in recognition to Briggs. "Agent Briggs, I assume you're here regarding the incident with Agent Williams?" he asked, though it was more of a statement than a question. Briggs inclined his head. "That's correct, Captain. Your officer detained Agent Williams without probable cause, obstructing her from performing her duties. I trust you understand the seriousness of this situation." Captain Reynolds's gaze shifted to Blake, his expression hardening. He had been informed of Blake's occasional lapses in judgment, but this crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. He turned to Blake, his voice sharp. "Blake, you've crossed boundaries before, but this? Detaining a federal agent without cause? What were you thinking?" Blake's face flushed a deep red as he tried to defend himself. "Captain, I thought she didn't—" Reynolds cut him off, his voice firm. "I don't want excuses, Blake. Your actions were reckless, plain and simple." He looked at Hansen, who had remained silent through the ordeal. "Did you have any part in this, Officer Hansen?" Hansen swallowed, his face pale. I didn't stop him," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I should have spoken up, but I didn't." Captain Reynolds shook his head, disappointment evident. "That's not good enough, Hansen. Silence is complicity, especially when it comes to situations like this." Briggs, watching this exchange, turned his gaze back to Blake. "Officer Blake, I'm reporting this incident up the chain. I expect full cooperation from your department, Captain. This isn't the first time one of my agents has faced obstruction, but I intend for it to be the last." Blake clenched his fists, a flicker of anger crossing his face. He knew that his actions would have serious consequences, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit fault. He straightened, his expression defiant, as if refusing to concede that he had made a mistake. "I was just doing what I thought was right," he muttered, though the conviction in his voice was long gone. Neek watched him, her expression unreadable, but there was a fire in her eyes that made it clear she wouldn't back down. She had faced more dangerous situations than this, but the personal betrayal, being treated as a criminal by someone meant to uphold the law, cut deeply. It was more than an individual grievance. It represented a systemic problem that had haunted her and many others for far too long. Captain Reynolds, sensing that Blake's pride was only going to cause further problems, turned to Hansen. "Hansen, I expect you to file a full report on this incident by the end of the day. And as for you, Blake, you'll be on suspension until further notice. This behavior has no place in our department." The room fell silent as Blake's face turned an even deeper shade of red. His hands shook slightly, his pride wounded in front of his colleagues and a federal agent. But even as he stared at the ground, there was a hint of resentment in his eyes, a look that suggested he wouldn't let this go easily. Briggs, seeing the simmering anger in Blake's expression, stepped closer, his voice low but unyielding. "If you think this is over, Officer Blake, I'd suggest you reconsider. Any attempt to retaliate or cover up what happened here today will only make things worse for you. The Secret Service doesn't take kindly to threats or misconduct. especially when directed toward one of our own. Blake's defiance seemed to waver, but his jaw remained clenched. The other officers in the station looked on, some with relief, others with discomfort, as if grappling with the reality of what had unfolded. For many, it was a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked authority, the dangers of allowing personal biases to overshadow the duty to serve and protect. Briggs turned to Neek, his expression softening. "Agent Williams, if you'd like to take a few minutes, I'll wait here to escort you out." He spoke to her with the respect due a colleague, a sign that the Secret Service stood firmly behind her. Neek nodded, giving him a brief but appreciative look. She knew that this incident would likely have a ripple effect, stirring up questions and prompting changes. At least, she hoped so. As she walked past Blake, she met his gaze one last time, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence spoke volumes. Blake, unable to hold her gaze, looked away, a mixture of anger and shame flashing across his face. Neek's calm resilience, her refusal to be intimidated or broken by his actions, was a silent victory that would resonate far beyond the walls of that station. Hansen, watching her leave, felt a surge of regret. He knew he should have done more, that his silence had only added to the injustice she endured. But as he looked around at his fellow officers, he realized that his silence wasn't just his own failing. It was a product of a system that too often encouraged blind loyalty over accountability. This incident would be a turning point for him, a reminder that standing by was never truly neutral. It was a choice, one he would have to reckon with. As Neek exited the station with Briggs by her side, she felt a sense of relief mingled with determination. This was more than just a personal victory. It was a small but significant step toward challenging a flawed system. The battle wasn't over, far from it. But this moment, this confrontation, had set something in motion, a catalyst for change that she hoped would spread beyond her own experience. Outside, the sun was shining, its warmth contrasting with the chill that had lingered in the station. Neek took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what had happened but also the strength that had carried her through it. She wasn't just walking away from an incident. She was stepping into a larger fight for justice, one that she now felt more committed to than ever before. And she knew that with allies like Briggs and the truth on her side, she wouldn't be fighting alone. Blake's suspension left a tension simmering through the station, and although it was meant to be a measure of accountability, he took it as a personal insult and an affront to his authority. In the days that followed, he stewed, unable to accept that he was at fault, replaying the scene in his mind and twisting it to fit his own narrative. To Blake, Nick was a threat, not to public safety but to his pride, his sense of order, and, above all, his unchallenged authority. That resentment festered, feeding a growing determination to shift the blame away from himself. Slowly, Blake began to plot, convinced that his suspension was unjust and that he had to retaliate to restore his reputation. Determined to save face, Blake started whispering to a few select colleagues, sowing seeds of doubt about Nick's credibility. He portrayed her as a provocateur, someone who had overstepped, fabricating a story about her resisting his questioning. For Blake, every story was a twisted justification of his actions, reinforcing the illusion that he had been wronged. And, for a few officers, his version of events was enough to rekindle their loyalty. They saw his situation as part of a larger battle against external interference in local policing. But while Blake's story was gaining minor traction among his sympathizers, not everyone in the department believed him. Hansen, in particular, felt a gnawing guilt for the part he had played. In the days since Nick's detention, he'd replayed every detail in his mind, realizing how deeply he had failed. Not just Nick, but also the principles of justice he'd once sworn to uphold. He remembered the quiet strength in her eyes as she faced Blake's aggression, the professional restraint she had shown despite being humiliated and treated unfairly. And it wasn't just that she had been right, she had also given him an unspoken lesson in courage and accountability. It became impossible for Hansen to ignore his own complicity and the moral obligation he had to set things right. Hansen wrestled with his conscience for days, feeling trapped between loyalty to his department and the overwhelming sense of duty he felt to expose the truth. Each day, his internal struggle intensified until finally, one evening, he made a decision. He knew he had to confront Blake's lies, to do more than just stand by as the situation spiraled further out of control. Determined to gather evidence, Hansen decided to check the station's audio records from the day of Niek's detention, hoping they would capture the interaction he had witnessed firsthand. The records confirmed everything Hansen remembered: Blake's initial racially charged comments, Niek's calm insistence on her credentials, Blake's refusal to acknowledge her badge. All of it was there, undeniable, unaltered. The clarity of the recording gave Hansen both relief and a renewed sense of purpose. There was now no room for excuses. But as he sat in the quiet of the dimly lit station, the weight of what he was about to do sank in. He knew that exposing this truth would mean challenging not only Blake, but also the fragile loyalty of his peers, and that decision might come with personal and professional costs. Hansen took the audio recording and made copies, preparing himself for the difficult conversations to come. He knew he had to speak with Niek first, to let her know that he was ready to support her and that the truth was about to come to light. He reached out, arranging a quiet meeting at a nearby park where they could talk without drawing attention. As they sat on a bench, the autumn leaves rustling around them, Hansen felt a weight lift as he finally confessed his silence, his fear, and his guilt to Niek. He offered her the recording, an apology etched into every word he spoke, his eyes unable to meet hers for long. Niek listened carefully, her face thoughtful and composed, but her expression softened as she realized Hansen's sincerity. She saw the inner turmoil that had clearly taken a toll on him, the same system that had kept him silent finally forcing him to choose between justice and blind loyalty. When he finished, Niek nodded, accepting both the recording and his apology. She could see that Hansen was ready to stand by her, and while his silence had hurt her, his willingness to speak up now offered a glimmer of hope that change was possible, even within a deeply flawed system. Armed with the recording and Hansen's testimony, Niek was ready to fight back, not just for herself, but to expose the wider culture of bias and abuse of power that had allowed Blake to act unchecked. She contacted her agency's legal team, and together they began to build a case. It wasn't long before the media caught wind of the story, and soon Niek's ordeal became national news. Reporters picked up on the recording and the details of her wrongful detention, highlighting both her professionalism and the shocking disregard for protocol she had endured. The pressure mounted as the story circulated, sparking public outrage and calls for accountability. Citizens and activists began to speak out, organizing protests outside the precinct and demanding reforms. The recording became a powerful rallying cry, underscoring the need for police accountability and shining a spotlight on the department's broader issues of racial bias. The precinct, once silent and unexamined, was suddenly under scrutiny from both the public and internal investigators, and the ripples of Niek's courage began to spread further than anyone could have anticipated. Blake, now feeling cornered and increasingly desperate, made one final, reckless attempt to turn the situation in his favor. Enlisting a few of his sympathizers within the department, he began to fabricate evidence, trying to plant false documents that would suggest Niek had been operating under false pretenses or engaged in misconduct during her visit. It was a last-ditch effort to discredit her and salvage his reputation, but it was sloppy and transparent. He underestimated not only Niek's determination, but also the scrutiny now focused on the case. Investigators quickly uncovered the scheme, exposing the planted evidence and implicating several officers who had conspired with Blake. Hansen, watching Blake's reckless actions, was both dismayed and relieved. Dismayed that his former partner would go so far to maintain his pride, but relieved that justice was finally closing in. It was a painful realization that the department he had trusted was capable of such deceit, but for the first time he felt empowered to stand on the right side. He knew he would face backlash, that he might even lose the trust of colleagues he once counted as friends, but he had made peace with it, Hansen was ready to be a witness, to back Nick's case with both his testimony and his moral conviction. He was ready to stand for the truth, no matter the cost. As the investigation progressed, Nick's case gained momentum. The Secret Service provided additional support, sending representatives to ensure she had the resources and protection needed to withstand the pressures and threats aimed her way. Nick prepared herself for the upcoming legal battle, aware that this wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about holding Blake and the department accountable. With each passing day, her resolve deepened, her sense of purpose amplified by the support she received from colleagues, advocates, and even strangers who believed in her fight. In response to the growing public outrage, the precinct's leadership made a rare acknowledgement, releasing a statement pledging to investigate the incident and promising transparency. But for Nick, words alone wouldn't suffice. She pushed for real, actionable reform, calling for comprehensive reviews of the department's practices and mandatory training to address the racial bias that had fueled her wrongful detention. She wasn't interested in symbolic gestures. She wanted lasting change, reforms that would protect others from suffering the same injustice. Hansen, standing by her side, watched with admiration as Nick took on not just her personal fight, but the larger battle against systemic corruption. He felt the weight of his silence lift, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. In joining her cause, he found a way to redeem himself, to align with the ideals he had once aspired to uphold. Together, they prepared for the case that would bring Blake and his conspirators to court. It was a complex battle, one that stretched over weeks as testimonies were heard, evidence was examined, and the department's practices were dissected in a public courtroom. Nick's resilience and clarity made a powerful impression, her every word underscoring the importance of integrity, accountability, and justice. Blake's attempts to paint himself as a misunderstood officer crumbled under the weight of the evidence and testimonies, exposing his deceitful actions to everyone present. By the time the verdict was reached, the impact of Nick's fight extended far beyond that courtroom. Blake and his conspirators faced disciplinary action and charges that ranged from obstruction to evidence tampering, while Hansen received both support and criticism for his decision to testify. The case prompted an internal overhaul within the precinct, with the implementation of new accountability measures and training programs designed to combat racial bias. For Nick, it was a hard-won victory, a testament to her courage and the strength it took to face an entire system with integrity. As she stood outside the courthouse after the final hearing, the crowd around her filled with supporters, journalists, and activists, Nick felt a sense of closure mingled with a new resolve. This case was over, but the fight against injustice was far from finished. She had seen the power of speaking out, of standing up against those who wielded power without accountability, and she knew she would continue to fight for a system that served all people equally. Hansen joined her outside, standing silently by her side, his presence a symbol of both redemption and solidarity. Their journey was one of transformation, not just of individuals, but of an entire community awakened to the possibility of change. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, activists, and citizens waiting anxiously as Nick and her legal team prepared to address the media. This wasn't just a local story anymore. Nick's case had become a national issue, sparking debates about racial bias, accountability, and the pressing need for reform in law enforcement. Nick felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but there was also a deep, unwavering sense of purpose that had carried her through every grueling day since that first confrontation with Officer Blake. She took a steadying breath, glancing around at the faces in the crowd, some familiar and some not. Her colleagues from the Secret Service were present, a quiet show of support, standing alongside community activists and civil rights advocates who had rallied for her cause. Hansen stood a few steps back, his face a mix of relief and solemnity. He knew what this moment meant for Nick, and he knew that by coming forward, he'd helped bring justice to her. But he also understood that the battle wasn't only about one person's story. It was about challenging the broader, insidious culture that had allowed this injustice to happen in the first place. The flash of cameras and murmur of voices stilled as Niek stepped up to the microphone, her expression calm yet resolute. She thanked her legal team, her colleagues, and her supporters before addressing the crowd. Her voice was steady but carried an emotional weight, each word deliberate and powerful. "Today, justice was served, but this is just the beginning," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "What happened to me could happen to any person of color walking down the street, minding their own business, simply trying to live their life. This case was never just about me. It's about every person who has been marginalized, every voice that has been silenced, and every life that has been unjustly disrupted by unchecked power and prejudice." The crowd listened in silence, captivated as Niek continued. "I shouldn't have had to prove my worth, my credentials, or my humanity to be treated fairly, and neither should anyone else. This is a call to action, a reminder that we must all stand against the systems that enable discrimination and protect those who misuse their power. Today, we begin the work of change, of building a system that serves all of us, equally and without prejudice." Her words echoed with conviction, and as she spoke, people in the crowd nodded, some even wiping away tears. It was clear that Niek's words weren't just rhetoric, they were a rallying cry, a moment of clarity for many who had been on the sidelines. She spoke with a sense of urgency, and her message resonated with those who had experienced or witnessed similar injustices. Her call for reform wasn't only directed at law enforcement, but at every level of society where prejudice still lurked in the shadows, unchallenged and unaddressed. As Niek concluded her speech, she made a powerful declaration. "I am not done. I will continue to fight, not just for myself, but for all those who deserve to be heard. We must stand together to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Today, we take the first step, but there is a long road ahead, and I am committed to walking it." A wave of applause surged through the crowd, mixed with cheers and affirmations. Niek stepped back, her face calm but her heart pounding. She knew her words had struck a chord, igniting something larger than her own experience. The press conference marked a turning point, and she felt the collective energy of the people around her, ready to move forward together. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a shift in the conversation, a catalyst for change that had been a long time coming. In the days that followed, Niek's story remained in the headlines, becoming a national rallying cry for justice reform. Her ordeal illuminated the stark reality of racial profiling and misuse of power within law enforcement, sparking debates and prompting people to take a closer look at their own communities. Civil rights organizations and activist groups took up her cause, organizing town hall meetings, forums, and protests to call for deeper investigations into police departments nationwide. The precinct where Blake worked was now under intense scrutiny, with external auditors reviewing past complaints, examining patterns of misconduct, and recommending significant changes to their policies. As public pressure mounted, city officials announced a series of measures aimed at addressing the systemic issues exposed by Niek's case. These included mandatory bias training, greater oversight on arrests and detainments, and stricter penalties for officers found guilty of misconduct. A committee was formed to investigate the precinct's handling of racial profiling cases, and they began to evaluate policies that allowed unchecked power to flourish. But change didn't come without resistance. Blake's supporters, both in the precinct and among certain segments of the public, viewed the new measures as excessive, a response to what they dismissed as an isolated incident. They argued that the reforms threatened the authority of law enforcement and framed the issue as a challenge to the trust between officers and the public. It was a divisive reaction, highlighting the broader rift between communities seeking justice and institutions reluctant to relinquish power. Meanwhile, Blake himself faced formal charges of misconduct, obstruction, and evidence tampering. The case against him was solid, bolstered by the recording Hansen had provided and the testimony of multiple witnesses who had seen his actions firsthand. The evidence spoke for itself, leaving no room for interpretation. For Naik, this was a hard-won victory. But she knew it wasn't just about punishing one individual. It was about setting a precedent, proving that accountability was possible even within a system that often protected its own. In the weeks leading up to Blake's trial, Neek continued her advocacy, speaking at community events and giving interviews to raise awareness about the need for systemic reform. Her voice became a powerful one in the fight for accountability, and people began to see her not only as a victim, but as a leader, someone willing to challenge the status quo. She was invited to speak at rallies and conferences, and her words inspired others to come forward with their own stories, strengthening the movement for transparency and justice in law enforcement. One of the most impactful moments came when Naik and Hansen appeared together at a public forum, speaking candidly about the ordeal and the choices they had made. Hansen, his voice full of regret, shared his experience of wrestling with silence and complicity, openly acknowledging his initial failure to act. He spoke of the courage it took for him to finally confront the truth and support Neek, even at great personal risk. His words resonated with the crowd as he explained how his own silence had perpetuated the problem and how his decision to come forward was, in many ways, an attempt to atone for his mistakes. His vulnerability moved people, shedding light on the struggles of those within the system who sought to do the right thing despite overwhelming pressure. Together, Neek and Hansen presented a powerful message of accountability and redemption. They represented the possibility of change, not just for the victims of injustice, but for those within the system willing to confront and correct their own failings. Their partnership became a symbol of reconciliation, a bridge between communities and institutions, proving that change was possible when people were willing to stand together, even across deep divides. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom was filled with tension. Testimonies revealed a pattern of misconduct that went beyond Blake, hinting at a wider culture within the precinct that tolerated racial profiling and looked the other way when officers overstepped their bounds. Blake's defense grew weaker as each witness spoke, painting a picture of a man consumed by prejudice and unwilling to accept responsibility for his actions. The final blow came when the recording was played for the court, a stark reminder of the contempt and hostility Blake had displayed toward Neek and the complete disregard he had shown for her credentials and humanity. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Blake was found guilty on multiple counts, and his sentencing served as a message to those who believed they could act without accountability. It was a moment of closure for Neek, but it was also bittersweet. She knew that one conviction wouldn't undo the damage caused by years of prejudice and abuse within the system, but it was a start, a step toward the broader change she had fought so hard to achieve. With Blake's conviction, the calls for reform grew louder, and Neek's role in sparking that change became a cornerstone of the movement. The precinct instituted a series of sweeping changes, including body cameras on all officers, anonymous complaint channels for citizens, and stricter disciplinary policies for misconduct. The department was no longer a fortress of unchallenged authority. It was becoming a place where accountability mattered, where officers could no longer act with impunity. In the months following the trial, Neek continued to advocate for reform, her experience inspiring others across the country to demand better from their own communities. She became an outspoken advocate for justice reform, joining forces with activists and civil rights organizations to push for policy changes at the state and national levels. Her work was far from over, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose, driven by the knowledge that her fight had not been in vain. At the same time, Hansen found himself transformed by the experience. Though he faced backlash from some within the department, he also received support from those who saw his actions as courageous and necessary. He remained at the precinct, determined to be a voice for change from within, challenging the culture that had allowed Blake's actions to go unchecked. His partnership with Neek, though unconventional, had become a source of strength, a reminder that true justice required courage and integrity from all sides. The legacy of Neek's fight echoed through the community and beyond. Her courage had sparked a movement, a relentless push for justice that was now too powerful to ignore. She had proven that one person, standing firm against a system designed to silence dissent, could inspire others to demand accountability. And as she looked toward the future, Neek knew that her journey was far from over, but she was ready to keep pushing, to continue fighting for a world where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality for all. The months following the trial brought a period of profound reflection for Neek. She had fought her way through injustice and emerged with her dignity intact, her voice louder and her purpose clearer than ever. But with the victory came a deeper realization of the road ahead and the scope of the challenges still facing her community and the country at large. The battle she had fought wasn't just her own. It was a symbol of a larger fight against the deeply embedded patterns of prejudice that continued to plague the justice system. Despite her personal success in securing accountability, Neek knew that one victory didn't solve everything. She felt a responsibility to keep pushing, to use her platform to make lasting, structural change. Hansen, too, faced a time of introspection. He had learned a hard lesson about silence, about how standing by and saying nothing could make someone complicit in injustice. While he hadn't been the primary aggressor, he had played a role, and he knew he would carry that weight with him. Yet, Neek's forgiveness and his decision to ultimately stand by her had given him a renewed purpose. He recognized that he had a unique position from within the system to make a difference, to advocate for reform, and to speak out against the kind of biases he'd once ignored. The backlash he faced from some colleagues didn't shake his resolve. Instead, it strengthened his commitment. If he could encourage just one officer to reconsider their actions, to break free from a culture that protected abuse, he knew he'd be doing the right thing. Together, Neek and Hansen's journey continued, though now they were united by a shared sense of purpose. They held speaking engagements across the country, meeting with community leaders, activists, and other law enforcement officers who were open to change. Their story resonated far and wide. People were inspired not just by Neek's courage but by Hansen's decision to acknowledge his mistakes and choose accountability over loyalty to flawed norms. Their partnership became a model for bridging divides and fostering difficult conversations that challenged people to confront their own biases and question the systems they upheld. As Neek spoke at forums, town halls, and on national news networks, her message was consistent and clear. True justice means accountability, not just for the actions we commit, but for the actions we allow to happen. She encouraged law enforcement agencies to implement policies that would protect citizens and prevent abuses of power. She pushed for training programs that emphasized empathy, accountability, and community engagement, urging officers to see their roles as protectors rather than enforcers. Her voice became a powerful force, and her commitment to justice inspired a movement that called for comprehensive reform within police departments, from training and hiring practices to the way complaints were handled. In the wake of her advocacy, legislative initiatives emerged, with state and local governments drafting bills aimed at increasing police accountability. Neek was asked to testify in front of several legislative committees, where she shared her experience and presented her vision for a justice system rooted in fairness, transparency, and community trust. She worked alongside civil rights organizations to craft policy recommendations, contributing her insights to ensure that future reforms address the root issues of bias and misconduct. The reforms she proposed included creating independent oversight bodies for law enforcement, requiring body cameras for all officers, and establishing clear protocols for handling complaints of bias and misconduct. Neek's efforts began to bear fruit as several states passed new laws implementing her recommendations. She knew that policy alone wouldn't change hearts and minds, but it was a crucial step toward creating a system where accountability was non-negotiable. The reforms sparked hope within communities that had long felt marginalized and ignored. People who had once felt powerless against institutional bias found a sense of empowerment, knowing that there were advocates like Neek who were determined to bring justice within reach. Despite the positive momentum, Neek faced resistance from those who felt threatened by the changes. Some in law enforcement saw her as an agitator, an outsider pushing for reforms that they believed would weaken their authority. Neek received backlash, including hate mail and online harassment, but she didn't let it deter her. She knew that the push for justice had always been met with opposition, and she leaned into the support of her allies, both within and outside of law enforcement. Her resilience only grew as she realized that every voice of dissent meant she was making an impact, challenging the status quo and forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths. Hansen, still working within the precinct, became an unexpected ally in Neek's reform efforts. He shared her message with his fellow officers, encouraging open dialogues about implicit bias and the importance of self-reflection. His transformation became an inspiration to other officers who had once shared Blake's attitudes but were now reconsidering their beliefs. Hansen organized workshops and informal meetings where officers could discuss their experiences and confront the biases they held. Some resisted, unwilling to challenge their ingrained perspectives, but others were receptive, grateful for a space where they could address issues they had previously been too afraid to admit. Slowly, a shift began to take place within the precinct, a culture change spurred on by Hansen's willingness to speak out. Meanwhile, Neek continued to mentor young people, encouraging them to pursue careers in law and public service. She wanted to inspire a new generation of leaders who understood the value of justice and the importance of standing up for what was right. Her words resonated with students and young professionals who saw her as a role model, someone who had not only endured injustice but had turned her experience into a platform for change. She encouraged them to enter law enforcement, the judicial system, and political roles where they could make a difference from the inside out, transforming institutions that had historically failed them. In one memorable meeting, Neek spoke to a group of college students studying criminal justice. She shared her journey, the obstacles she had faced, and the hard choices she had made. A young woman in the audience raised her hand and asked, "How do you keep going, knowing that the fight is so long and difficult?" Neek paused, her eyes thoughtful, and replied, "Because I know that every step we take makes it a little easier for those who come after us. The change may be slow, but it's real, and it's worth every fight, every setback. We're creating a world where one day, no one will have to question whether justice is on their side." Her words left an indelible mark on the students, many of whom later reached out to her for guidance as they pursued careers dedicated to justice. Neek's influence extended far beyond her own experiences. She was shaping a movement, inspiring countless others to carry the torch forward, ensuring that the struggle for equality and accountability would continue. Through all this, Neek remained deeply committed to her vision of a justice system rooted in empathy, fairness, and transparency. Her journey was far from over, but she had laid the groundwork for a legacy of resilience, courage, and unwavering dedication to justice. The fight for reform was a marathon, not a sprint, and Neek was ready to keep running, leading others beside her, and pushing forward with a clear and determined heart. The lasting impact of her story wasn't just the policies that had been enacted or the reforms that were underway, it was the profound cultural shift she had inspired, a reminder that one voice, if loud enough, if determined enough, could challenge an entire system and leave a legacy of hope for generations to come.